Okay, hello everybody. We are going to embark here on a discussion of our sort of next iteration of our long run model, which is called the Romer model. So basically, we're going to go back. The first video will probably cover most of my first bullet point here. We'll go back and review some concepts that I hope you were exposed to in a Principles of Micro class. And if you weren't, that's okay. We're gonna review those. And then we're gonna go back to our production model and we're gonna make it better. And at the end of all this, we will have sort of fixed the major drawback to the solo model, which is that the solo model, once it gets to the steady state, just sits there and doesn't really do anything. So these micro concepts that I mentioned, this is the idea of a object versus an idea. So you may wonder what these have to do with microeconomics, like because I said, review some micro concepts. Well, the idea here is that markets do a very good job of allocating resources to some of these things. And in fact, two things that we consider objects that I've listed here, like land, labor, capital, land, machinery, workers, things like that in the physical world. Markets do a pretty good job of allocating resources so that we get the sort of efficient amount of these. But ideas don't necessarily work the same way, right? And markets kind of fail to do a good job with many things that are not objects. So the way that I want to lay this out here is we got two dimensions. The first one is called rivalry, where we can define a good or a service as being rival or non-rival in consumption. If something is rival, then me consuming it or a unit of it means that there is nothing left for others to consume, right? I sort of use it up, so to speak. So as an example here, right, if I had pasta for dinner last night, I ate it. It's gone. No one else gets to eat the same pasta. Um, the reverse of that, or the converse of that, the non-rival good, is something that gets, right, my consuming of it doesn't prevent anybody else from also consuming. I'm using consuming in kind of a broad sense here, but my consuming doesn't stop others from consuming. So streetlights is a sort of classical example of this. This is something called streetlights are usually considered something we call a public good that we'll define in just a minute. Um, but benefiting from the streetlights, me benefiting from it doesn't stop others from benefiting from it as well. Okay, so that's one of these two dimensions that I want to introduce. The other dimension is something called excludability. So goods can be classified as either excludable or non-excludable. And I should mention that this is not necessarily meant to describe things in detail. There's kind of a continuum. You could think of things that are, well, they're mostly excludable, or they're mostly rival. Well, they're pretty much, non-excludable. But you can always think up examples that don't quite fit neatly into these categories. But for our purposes, we're just sort of concerned about the big picture stuff here. Excludability determines who gets access. If something is excludable, if a good or service is excludable, it means that I can't get access to something without paying for it, right? Pasta doesn't just fall from the sky. I have to go to the store and exchange some money to purchase the pasta. Something that's non-excludable, well, you can't stop people from getting access to the good or enjoying the good or service who don't pay. And so streetlights, again, are a good example there. Whether you contribute to the tax base or not, the streetlights are on. And so anybody who drives by, whether they've contributed to the streetlights directly or not, still sort of enjoys access to them, right? We don't just turn off the streetlights when we know somebody from out of town is driving around. So if we take these two dimensions and put them together, the rivalry and the excludability, we come up with four different categories of good, right? Something that is rival in consumption and excludable, that is something that we call a private good. And this is something that markets are good at, right? Markets do a pretty good job of providing the right level of private goods. But markets do not do a good job, left to their own devices, of managing these other three. So things that are non-rival in consumption but excludable, these are sometimes called artificially scarce, or sometimes these are called club goods. Right, the sort of classic example is something like pay-per-view television, like a streaming service or something like that. Right, once a television series has been filmed and recorded and edited and starts streaming on, Netflix or what have you, it's not rivaling consumption, right? One person watching, binge watching an entire season doesn't stop anybody else from watching that same series or that same season, but it is excludable, right? Now you might argue, oh, that's not excludable because, I can go find pirated copies of that somewhere. Yes, that's true. That's sort of an issue in getting the right amount of this good provided. And there's actually kind of an interesting literature on that as well. But we're not going to get deep into that. So like a streaming service, my streetlights are a good example of a public good that's non-rival and non-excludable. And then fisheries are kind of a classic example here of something that is an open access resource, or sometimes called a common resource. This is a market failure that is sometimes referred to as the tragedy of the commons. But anyway, markets are really only good at providing private goods. They are not very good at providing these other types of goods. Now, what I want to sort of move on to is this difference between ideas and objects again. Ideas are kind of by nature non-rival, right? We don't have this problem, well, not problem, but we don't have this physical characteristic that they get used up, right? And we also, well, let's not worry about excludability for right now, but ideas are certainly not rival. Ideas can be shared without anybody sort of losing out, other than the cost of coming up with those ideas. And that kind of leads us to the problem here, is that implementing new ideas can be very expensive. Just think about, I've just made up some basic numbers here. So we have some new battery technology, cost $200 million to develop. I'm thinking something like, EV batteries or something like that. The batteries cost $1,000 each to produce. How should the firm price the batteries? Well, let's kind of think about that for a minute. Maybe you want to even sort of pause the video here and think about, well, how do I want to price this, right? Well, think about how many would you need to sell if your marginal cost is $1,000, you'd need to produce, well, what do we got? We got 200 million, right? And they each cost 1,000. If you charged $1,000 for each of them, well, think about how many. You'd have to produce 200,000 just to break even. If you charged $1,000 each for these, you'd have to scale up pretty big to get the benefit of, to even be sort of induced as a developer, as a battery technology developer, to even produce these. And so the question is, well, we have to have this huge scale to even achieve this. And then, right, okay, well, now we've covered the marginal cost, right? But we still haven't paid off. Right? Sorry, let me put that the other way. We've now, at this $1,000, we've paid off the development costs, but those $200,000 batteries cost us $1,000 each to produce. So pricing at $1,000, all we did was pay off our development costs. We actually produced the batteries for free, essentially. So we'd actually need to price them at $2,000, right? So the idea here is that we can't price at marginal cost. We need to price at something above that. when we get really, really large, we have really large economies of scale, then we can start to benefit from that. But ideas are really expensive. I don't want to get bogged down here in some of the micro stuff, but I want you to kind of be aware. So the bottom line is that companies, to avoid losing money, they need the price, they need the price to exceed the average cost of production. Okay, the problem is that isn't economically efficient, right? So this is, again, this is my long-winded way of saying markets don't do a good job of this necessarily. So the solution to this is to try to find a way to allow firms to recapture some of their development costs. And I've got the list of, potential solutions here. Things like patents that have a certain amount of time that they last, trade secrets. Governments could provide subsidies. Governments could foot the bill for those huge fixed costs. Maybe you can think of some other incentives that would allow this to happen. Okay, so this video has gotten a little bit long. I didn't necessarily mean for this intro to be quite so long. So what we'll do next in the next video is we'll go into our production function and start actually building the basics of the new version of our model. And I will see you there shortly.